Baroness Claire Fox, independent peer and director of the Academy of Ideas. We did, of course, sit together in the European Parliament for the Brexit Party, and she's a woman who's does great things, a very necessary person when it comes to fighting the good fight. Claire, great to have you on the programme. Now, talking about fighting the good fight, what on earth do you think this man with the AK-47 tattooed on his face has come to Britain for? He seems like a man who's ready to fight a fight, that's for sure.
Actually, the irony of this guy is that he's probably less threatening than quite a lot of other people who come on the boats, in as much as what he seems to want to be is a TikTok influencer, like every other young person in the West. He's unpleasant in the content of his TikToks, the Kalashnikov, the threats, the, imitation of shooting people, very dangerous vibes coming out of him. But in some ways, it's kind of all done in plain sight. I'm actually slightly worried about the people who are coming in and we don't know who they are. No security checks done on them. This guy has been detained. A lot of the other people will just kind of disappear into the ether, and who knows?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. We were discussing earlier on in the programme. I've been banging on recently a lot about Al-Qaeda 2.0, and we know that they are using forged passports and trafficking routes, A, to make money, but B, no doubt, to flood Europe with people who are rather fond of their aims. And if we know this, if the government's counter-terrorism czar has said this, if Robert Jenrick, who's standing to be leader of the Conservative Party, said, when I was immigration minister, I knew that at least 1,000 people had come over on the boats under my tenure were connected to terrorism. Why on earth is more decisive action not being taken? I don't understand why, as a nation, we can't say this is now a national emergency, this is a security threat, and this is the radical action we're going to take.
Well, I think that one of the problems is that we've just got into complete mess about confusing any discussion about would-be asylum seekers, immigration full stop in many ways, and the problems of terrorism, of the Islamist threat that we know exists around Europe, around the world. And you're not allowed to talk about one without being accused of trying to talk about the other. So it makes it impossible to have a conversation. So obviously there will be people on the boats who think of themselves at least as legitimate asylum seekers. There are other people who paid a huge amount of money just to illegally arrive in the UK. And we're not allowed to criticise that action because somehow we can only blame the people traffickers, not the fact that people are trying to illegally get into a country. And then thirdly, we know that some of the people getting in will have malign intent and be people who are a danger and a threat. But you've seen, God, only recently, in a situation where people worry about or speak out loud or express concerns about the possibility that a particular action was a terrorist action, they are accused of being far right. We've seen that only very recently. Then when other information is revealed, we're told we can't discuss that because it's only an accusation, and so on and so forth. We all know I'm talking about the Southport killing, and I'm not trying to get into the detail of that because I know there are legal restrictions. But the point I'm making is that every attempt at having an open conversation about this situation is met by people who try and close you down. And I keep using this word, but try and gaslight you into thinking you're making it up. That it's not happening, that you must be informed by misinformation. So that, I think, makes it for politicians a cop-out, a way that they can just avoid confronting the problem. They can just hide away.
It's fascinating. I'm glad you brought it up, because the big risk of the whole, what I would suggest, I have a suspicion things were cynically sequenced when it came to the revelations of things surrounding Southport. And also it ties in again to the two-tierism. I don't think there would have been these riots if there hadn't been the Hare Hills riots prior to them. But why? Why aren't we allowed to talk about things? Why are we being gaslit to the extent that we are forcibly gagged? Why are we terrified now? I mean, even with this Southport stuff, the risk here, of course, is we'll also don't touch it, don't talk about it. Of course, when there's an active case and someone's been charged, you cannot, because you risk prejudicing a trial. Any journalist or sensible-minded person knows that, and what we want is a fair trial. But they've used this as well to mop up any criticism of the government or how the government have handled this in the communications with the public. And yet, Someone like Nigel Farage, frankly, should be vindicated. All he did was say at the start of all of this, I don't think we are being told the truth. Information is being withheld from us. He didn't say anything about what had gone on. He didn't say this man was doing this or doing that. He just said information is being withheld from us, which we knew because we weren't being told anything. So he was stating the blimmin' obvious. And yet, all of a sudden, all those characters around the government, even people sitting on those green benches, all waded in and started saying, oh, it's the Farage riots, hashtag Farage riots. They exploited a disgusting atrocity, then the subsequent gaslighting of the public to then try and take down and attack a political opponent. But what is going on, Claire? Why? Why this desperation? The political class now are too afraid to say, you know what, multiculturalism hasn't worked. It's imperiled the nation. Why can't they just do it?
Well, first of all, they don't believe that, largely. They actually think that the threat to social cohesion are people who are worried about the rise of Islamism, or are worried about the lack of integration of people newly coming to the country, or who are concerned about how you cope with vast numbers of people who are arriving in the UK, and we are in a situation where service provision is very shoddy, very poor, and there is inevitably tensions. They don't want to confront that, and they don't believe the problem is the immigration issue. They think the problem is the ordinary people who live in this country who don't go along with the programme. Now, the thing that we've got is I actually think that defending a fair trial is hugely important. I don't want to be overly conspiratorial about the Southport question, but I do think this. Those people who were charged subsequent to the riots with very serious offences, they also deserved a fair trial. But politicians stood up, as you say, from those green benches and from the red benches in the Lords, and denounced those people before they ever got to the trial as being far-right, racist, inciters of violence, accused people of terrible things. Now, whether it was true or not is not my point. If you're going to have a fair trial, if you've already called them violent yobs who are influenced by a political ideology before they've ever seen a judge, isn't that going to compromise a fair trial?
Yeah.
So get back to that feeling that, oh, why is there one rule for one group of people and not for another? If we're going to hold true to the fair trial rule, which is fair, then you must apply it across the board. But it's also the case that you can't allow a situation to arise where when people perfectly rationally and reasonably ask a question, for example, when a soldier was stabbed in daylight in the UK, and people ask, is that a terrorist attack? And people say, you're trying to stir up racial hatred by asking that. And then, as you say, and then little girls are stabbed. It appeared to be kind of like a mass attempt at killing young women in this country. And you're not allowed to say, is this a terrorist attack, without being maligned or traduced in some way.
Right, or worse still, suggested that you could end up in prison for that. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing.
I know. And it also, by the way, it fuels the people that you're supposedly trying to deal with. Because if you deny all information in the public sphere, treat people as though they are bad guys for even asking the question, you inevitably force people to look, as it were, or go down those rabbit holes, to take seriously the kind of swirl of genuine misinformation or rumour or all the rest of it. Well, the way that you deal with that is being as open and honest as you can possibly be with the British public. But the truth is, they don't trust the British public. They've already decided that if the truth becomes known, then what will happen is that there'll be pogroms and race riots and all the rest of it. Actually, they create the situation where you're going to have racial tension by not allowing people to have this conversation in the sunlight of public discussion would actually really help it.
Yeah, Tim.
Just really to to echo what Claire has just said there, I think it's incredibly important that the mainstream media do start sharing more information with us and trusting us. Because if the mainstream media don't do that, don't give us the basic facts, look like they're constantly covering up, where do people go? They do go to the worst corners of the internet, the worst corners of social media, where really nasty things are shared. So it's not a small matter that we feel like we're being censored. We are being censored. And when we're being censored by the BBC and other people, I'm afraid people start to go to sources which really do. We've been talking about grooming this morning, Alex. These people are then groomed by other sort of social media in a very dangerous way.
Makes them ripe for conspiracy.
Yeah.
Claire, now you are a huge advocate of free speech. It's not quite free speech, I suppose it's freedom of purchase, but there's this huge soar of sales of white poppies at the moment, particularly among young people. This is by the Peace Pledge Union. I've been trying to find out where their proceeds might be going. For me, I mean, I don't think you can turn around and ban anyone from selling something or ban anyone from buying it, but I think that it adds into the conversation we're having, this sort of undermining of social cohesion. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, I think it's worth noting that the white poppy started in 1933, so it's not exactly a new thing. And it kind of adopts itself. So this year it's kind of students pro-Gaza expression. I mean, we've got to a point now where, you know, what badge you wear and what lanyard you sport, you know, what colour it is, you know, becomes a kind of significant virtue signalling way of saying what your politics are. And obviously it's distasteful when it comes to people at the time of the remembrance not using the red poppy but wearing the white poppy. But I am much more worried about the fact that the British Legion themselves have gone down this path. I mean, you're always going to have peaceniks who are going to say, I'm not going to wear the red poppy, I'll wear a white poppy for whatever the fashionable cause of the day is. But how depressing it is that the British Legion started to use that progress flag, the pro-trans flag, as part of the poppies. Now, I think once an institution starts eating itself in that way, I mean, they didn't just start selling the red poppies, but they've introduced an element of politics. You can hardly expect the kind of peacenik lefty student brigade to conform, right? You can't say respect this poppy if you yourself have started eating away at the meaning of the poppy and playing identity politics. And just to say, you know, in terms of contemporary politics, today is very significant. In Germany, in 2024, today, is the first day in which there is self-ID being introduced into Germany, which means that any man can call themselves a woman, right? And there's protests outside all the German embassies happening all around Europe. It's a huge story, which, by the way, the media haven't covered enough. And this is obviously a real threat to women's rights. It's actually a charter for groomers, things that you've been talking about, but through the lens of the trans ideology route. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because I understand that, you know, things change. I mean, we fought 2 world wars against Germany. Now I'd say solidarity with German women against the German state who's bringing this in. Yeah. And what we want to do is we want to be able to commemorate the wars sensibly. People will wear their poppies accordingly. If the British Legion then starts playing and dancing with the kind of politics of, for example, self-ID or trans ideology, they are actually bringing on themselves their own destruction. They are disrespecting the thing which we then demand that those students who wear the white poppies should respect. Well, why should they? Yeah. They've already seen them eating themselves.
I mean, talking about young folk who are buying up these white poppies, it turns out that it's largely young folk as well who are the least likely to be in jobs at the moment. It's the 18 to 25 demographic are the ones most likely to be off sick. And it's turned out that now it seems that when it comes to UK benefits, half of that bill by 2029 is going to be for people off sick, costing us taxpayers 100 billion a year. 100 billion. It's eye-watering. We surely need to find a way. This can't go on. We can't have a society where nobody says they're healthy enough to go to work, and those that do go to work are having to pay more and more out of their earnings for other people to be unproductive. How do you think we need to tackle this, Claire?
So one of the difficulties with this problem is that it's almost largely cultural, because what we've done over the last, decade or so is to effectively expand the definition of what mental ill health is to such an extent, and that's become institutionalized in schools, in universities, across the board, so that, we can kind of lampoon the students who say they're going to get post-traumatic stress disorder if they, don't get a trigger warning before they hear Chaucer or whatever. We kind of hear these stories all the time. But actually more worrying in many ways is that there's become this notion of well-being has been brought into workplaces and universities, which says that if you're feeling any kind of anxiety at all, you need to have a formal counselling session with a well-being officer. This might be affecting your mental health and so on and so forth. So, of course, we've socialised the young into believing that the hardships, the everyday tribulations of life, the breaking up with someone, the feeling miserable, the hateful feeling that you get when you have to commute in the freezing cold or whatever, that these things will affect your mental health. And then we wonder why they're all having time off. The other thing, of course, was lockdown and COVID. Lockdown and COVID institutionalised the notion that ill health meant that you should be locked up at home and never leave the house. And if you think about what we said to the young who were not at risk of COVID, we said, this same generation who's slightly grown up a bit, who were at school, you can't go to school. We're closing all the schools down because we think that you shouldn't be allowed to leave the house, and so on and so forth. So it creates this atmosphere around sickness that actually undermines serious problems of mental illness, which, by the way, we should throw money at helping those who suffer debilitating depression and mental ill health. But the expanded, ever-growing sense in which any anxiety gets a diagnostic label is something that needs to be clamped down on. The only other thing that relates to the budget in this is that one of the reasons why people are getting the sick notes is because the doctor, it's just easier to just kind of go sick note, sick note, sick note when somebody turns up, rather than having the argument with some 22-year-old who says, I feel, if you don't take me seriously, it might affect my mental health, I might be suicidal. And we're now in a situation after the budget where one of the things the government didn't think about was that their national insurance contributions will have to probably be paid by GP surgeries. That's going to affect all sorts of doctors' ability. I mean, so much for reform of the NHS. They're actually attacking one of the areas. A lot of the charities that deal with, and NGOs that deal with people who might have mental ill health, they are employers, and they'll have to now pay huge amounts towards national insurance contributions, and they're going to be losing staff. Yeah. So it's so ironic that the things that could tackle this aren't going to be able to practically, but culturally we need to take the bull by the horns and stop medicalising every aspect of life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's affecting my mental health, that's for sure, Claire. But thankfully I've just spoken to you and you were the perfect antidote to the lot of it. Baroness Claire Fox there.